Thank you for joining us after lunch. It's nice to see you all here and welcome. My name is Scott Drummond and I'm the Head of Policy and Practice at VAADA. It is my pleasure to MC our second keynote on black market economics, enforcement, adaptation and the paradox of prohibition with Dr. James Martin, Senior Lecturer, Criminology, Course Director, School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin University. Dr. Martin is a Senior Lecturer in Criminology and Director of the Bachelor of Criminology. James is a leading researcher in the field of black markets, cybercrime and the dark web trade in illicit drugs. He has published numerous books and research articles on these topics in some of the world's most prestigious publications, including the British Medical Journal, Criminology and Criminal Justice and the British Journal of Criminology. James has also led or participated in large-scale research projects funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council. James is currently leading a research team funded by the Department of Home Affairs for research into national illicit nicotine market. Please welcome Dr. James Martin. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Scott, and hi everyone. It's fantastic to be with you all today, and thanks particularly to VAADA for inviting me to present to you. I'd like to take a moment as well to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today I want to speak to you about, it's a bit of a hodgepodge of research. These have been ideas that have been fermenting around my mind for some time, and there have been some real problems, some thorny issues, some paradoxes, one might say, that have emerged in really the longitudinal trends to do with drug policy and particularly drug enforcement that I'm concerned with, and things that, quite frankly, have had us stumped as criminologists. Things that we've needed to draw on genuinely interdisciplinary teams, people from public health and people from economics to get their expertise to try and answer and come up with some potential solutions to the kinds of problems that we're seeing. So there's a number of other researchers who've worked with me on these kinds of projects from those different disciplines, and I'll give them a shout out by name a little bit later where relevant. So in terms of what I'm going to speak with you about today, we've got a few different things. First up, we're going to be looking at some of the drug settings around policy and some of the longitudinal trends that we're seeing around drug enforcement and drug prevalence, drug use, and what the drug markets look like here in Australia. I know many of you, or most of you in this room, are working at the coalface, so this is very much a different perspective. This is a bird's eye, or very distant perspective that we're taking on these kind of processes and phenomenon, and hopefully we'll get some insights there. Part two, we're going to be looking at some insights from economics, and particularly one part of economics called game theory. Don't worry, there's not heaps of maths. I've included a tiny bit of maths in there, but I'm going to walk through you very slowly. I'm doing this for my own purposes as much as anyone else. Despite the title of my presentation, and increasingly my field of research, I'm a qualitative researcher by trade. Quantitative stuff is not my strong suit. And then the last part of the presentation is looking at what I call Australia's emerging war on nicotine. So we're increasingly relying on restrictive policies, whether that's to do with tobacco or alternative tobacco substitutes, things like vapes were the really big one there, but nicotine pouches, some of those other novel nicotine substances. This is a very controversial subject at the moment. People have very strong views about this topic, and there's a lot of well-intentioned, I think, debates going on, but I think there's a fair degree of moral panic around this as well. So I'm very happy to give you a little bit of my perspective on this preceding the vaping panel that I'll be sitting on with a bunch of very eminent experts tomorrow as well. All right, so with that all in mind, let's get started. So you'd all be aware of this. We have our national drug strategy. It's been more or less the same since 1985 when a very teary Bob Hawke announced that his daughter was an intravenous drug user, and we needed to move from a kind of punitive model to a harm minimisation approach. And that harm minimisation approach has crystallised over the decades to the three pillars that we're all very much aware with, I'm sure. We have our demand reduction, people working in treatment, community outreach, education. We have our harm reduction, so not necessarily trying to decrease drug use, but acknowledging that drug use will occur and trying to minimize the dangers, dangerous practices, the dangerous settings that can take place in. And then, of course, we have the big one, supply reduction. The talk today is going to be almost exclusively about supply reduction, not because it's the most important, but sadly, because it is the most funded. Oh, skip the slide. Oh, I'm missing a slide. Anyway, I could talk you through this because it's basically what everyone knows already. In terms of the funding that goes into these three different pillars that we have here, 2/3 of the funding goes into supply reduction, about 1/3 does go into demand reduction, but it's just, it's a tiny percentage, practically non-existent, that goes into harm reduction. This is not an evidence-informed approach. We know the relative cost effectiveness of these different kind of programs is not reflected in this disproportionate funding that we have that is going into supply reduction. It's the supply reduction, i.e. law enforcement, right? We're talking about border force, state police forces, and so on. Now, there is an important detail on the slide that I'm missing here, and that is about the increases in funding. You'd all be aware of Alison Ritter and her wonderful team at NDARC. She's done a series of really excellent drug budgets, they call, where they break down all the different allocations in spending across the different aspects, the different pillars, if you like, of Australia's drug policy. So we know overwhelmingly the funding is going into law enforcement, which is about $3.5 billion every year. Well, it was in the year 2021, we're spending on drug law enforcement specifically. That is 3 times what was spent in 2009, 2010. All right, so in a period of around 13, 14 years, we've seen a tripling of the funding that has gone into drug law enforcement. The key questions that I want to pose is that money well spent? Is drug law enforcement doing what it is intended to do? Now, what is it actually intended to do? Well, this is where we get into some of the criminological theories around this, and the big one. This is one of those kind of, totemic theories that dominates any particular way of thinking, and this is basically the intellectual rationale behind why so much of this money should go into supply reduction, and it's called the risks and prices framework. By 2 very distinguished scholars, Roeder and Kleiman. They first started writing about this in the 1980s. And the theory goes something like this, that by increasing risk, which you do through increased enforcement intensity, so more cops on the ground, more penalties, so increased penalties for possession, and particularly for distribution, more border scanning services at the border. All of that is supposed to increase the amount of risk that is in the illicit drug market. And what that should translate through is higher prices on the street. If you have higher prices on the street, then people are supposed to use fewer illicit drugs than there were previously, in lower volumes. So we've got a decreased availability of drugs because you're seizing drugs at the border, you're taking drugs off people at the street. This reduces profits for the people that are there because they have to replace the drugs that are missing. They might have to replace key personnel who might be imprisoned or might be killed by competitors because, of course, for many people, lots of people, I think, on the street would think the biggest risk for a drug trafficker or a drug dealer on the street is the police. Chances are it's not. It's your chopper reads and similar kinds of people who aren't going to arrest you, but may chop off your toes, steal your stash, and leave you in a much worse off kind of state. So the idea here is that if you increase enforcement intensity in any particular drug market, and I am determined as a drug trafficker, as a drug supplier, to continue participating in that market, after replacing all my drugs and the increased risk that there is for me going to prison, I'm going to charge you more as a customer. Right? I'm going to put a cost premium on the drugs because I want to be compensated more because I'm dealing in such a dangerous environment. Again, which should increase the price, which should lead to decreased consumption. Lots of shoulds in here, so you might see where my presentation is going to take us. All right, so let's look at some of the numbers. And hats off to the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission here. They give us very detailed data in their annual illicit drug reports, but they haven't released any for the last couple of years. So we've only got information up to 2020-21. Crucially, they're missing information on illicit tobacco and other nicotine products, which is a bit of a gripe I'm taking up with them at the moment. But anyway, what we can see here is a few interesting trends. So I've broken these down by drugs seized at the border, drugs seized on the street as well, so within the country. And I've tried to make them color-coded appropriately. So the green is cannabis, light green is cannabis that is seized in the country, dark green, very little component of the columns there, that's cannabis that's seized at the border. Right, no major surprises here. Very little cannabis is seized at the border because we don't import very much cannabis at all. It's one of the few drugs that Australians, in international terms, don't pay particularly high prices for because we've got such a well-developed cultivation of cannabis here locally. You'll see those proportions increase for other drugs though. So for cocaine, ATS, that's amphetamine type stimulants, which is, I don't know, it's weird. They put methamphetamine and MDMA in the same category, despite, I think if you spoke to the average user, well, the average user profiles are very different. Anyway, that's not my classification, that's theirs. Now, we know that you can see here, there's much more of the seizures happening at the street level. This is because despite the image that the Australian Border Force has managed to project over the years, very few drugs actually get seized at the border. It's around 20 to 25% of the drugs that are consumed or that are trafficked into the country are successfully seized. So the vast majority make it through. We know this because we've got wastewater analysis these days. They've been doing these wastewater analyses since 2016, so we can assess the volumes of drugs in raw terms that are being consumed in the country. And of course, ABF have acknowledged this publicly, that they're not getting the vast amount of drugs that are coming through. So there should be a very obvious trend that you see here. Record amounts of seizures, right? Seizures going up and up and up every year. Now, I do want to say that even though a lot of my presentation here is critiquing the work of these agencies, so we've got our cops here. I love it how they're in tactical gear as well at a press conference. Not sure the rationale for having your fully automatic weapons in a bunker while you're doing a media conference, but I think this does speak to the performative nature of a lot of the law enforcement here. But this is not actually a slam on law enforcement. If you talk to many people, particularly senior people working in law enforcement, they know these things aren't working particularly well. It's not up to police to design policy, okay? We've got, so they're doing a job, and a pretty difficult, punishing and unrewarding one at that. So it's not a slam at them. Although it is a little bit on the uniforms, I've got to say. All right, so yeah, we've got a very clear trend line happening here, right? Record levels of seizures, and that's going up and up every year. So the police are doing stuff with the money that they are getting, okay? They are out there and getting busy. Now, when we look at drug arrests, we see a very, very similar trend here as well. It's important to note that across the different years here, around half of the arrests that you're looking at are for cannabis-related offences, so not necessarily what I think the public would like or even the police would like here. You will also notice a pretty troubling trend here as well, and that is the proportion of providers, so that's actually people who are supplying drugs, drug dealers, drug traffickers, well, the proportion has decreased. The raw numbers are about the same now as they were back in 2006 and 2007. So the vast majority of people getting caught up, arrested, and brought into the vast machinery of our criminal justice system are people at the consumer end, definitely not the big fish. And that trend is getting worse. So we can see here, similar to the previous slide, very clear trend up. There's a dip here, almost certainly due to COVID. So if we didn't have COVID, once the ACIC does get around to releasing their new drug reports, we could expect this reasonably to continue. All right, so we've got our record arrests, we've got our record seizures. Risks and prices framework tells us that this should be increasing risk in the illicit drug market more generally. That should translate into higher prices, reduced availability, and decreased prevalence and consumption. Now, this is where we've got to do our shout out to the NDARC team. So Sutherland et al. Here. This is from the IDRS and EDRS monitoring programs. Again, for an illicit drug researcher, it's wonderful to live in a country where you have these fantastic data sources out there. And I spent a lot of time with my black market economics undergraduates, really nose deep in this kind of data. But again, you will see very interesting trends here. Basically, no change. Right? If you look at the availability of illicit drugs, doesn't matter what they are, notwithstanding the COVID bump here, so just remove that. That's definitely nothing to do with law enforcement. you can see very clear trend lines, right? They're exactly the same. Cannabis, heroin, slight variations year on year, but the overall trend is the same, and that is drugs are just as easy to get now as they were back in 2007. Now, what about price? So these are prices from NDARC. ACIC do their own drug pricing as well. I'm always a little bit sus about using drug prices from law enforcement sources. I'm not sure what streets they're buying their drugs at, but I think they're getting a bit ripped off. But anyway, we do see some interesting moves here, right? So generally, there are some drugs like cannabis, drugs like MDMA, where we don't see any change at all, right? Cannabis was $20 a gram when I was in high school. I remember this quite clearly. And it's $20 a gram now. So some drug prices are stable. Other drug prices are going down. So we see drug prices for cannabis, not for cannabis rather, for heroin and cocaine decreasing, not heaps, but they're decreasing, but price for methamphetamine has dropped quite considerably. But you do get these, up and down sort of bumps. This is why this is, again, useful to look at over the very long period. These trends become more apparent. Now, a big part of the picture, and what is not being captured in this slide, is something that is the same price back in 2007 really the same price as what it is now? Think about how much coffee cost you back in 2007, or a pint of beer at the pub, or maybe something non-drug related, some other consumer item you might like as well. Typically, all of that stuff has gotten more expensive, right? We're living in a cost of living crisis, inflation crisis, prices are going through the roof. So once we adjust these prices, we adjust for inflation, we get some really interesting trends, and that is nearly every drug has not just got cheaper, but gotten significantly cheaper in what economists call real terms. So adjusted for what a dollar was actually worth back in 2007, methamphetamine hasn't just come down, it's half the price in real terms that it was in 2007. Cannabis, MDMA, any of the big drug categories you like, are significantly cheaper once you adjust for inflation. So this leaves us in a pretty weird spot, and it leaves risks and prices and law enforcement in a very strange spot. Oh yeah, one more graph here as well. So how is this actually translated to prevalence? So what we see recent use here, so this is, I should have labeled this graph, this is from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. Again, excellent source of data. What we see is illicit drug use generally trending up. Okay, it's gone up about 30% in proportional terms from 2007. So, we're up around the 18% of the population. So nearly 1 in 5 Australians have used an illicit drug at some point in the previous 12 months. That's including illicit pharmaceuticals. And actually, including illicit pharmaceuticals, any illicit drug trend makes a little bit more sense because some of the drugs are actually going down quite a lot. So if you take not if you take, but if we consider something like MDMA, for example, right? Despite the fact it's getting cheaper, MDMA use has actually gone down. So this is the same if we look at our wastewater analysis. There's not only fewer people consuming MDMA, there's much less volume of MDMA being consumed in the country. Fewer people using methamphetamine, although there's good evidence to suggest that the minority of people that are using methamphetamine are using it in increasingly higher quantities, so that use is becoming increasingly problematic. And we see a similar kind of trend with heroin. Heroin use, if you look at wastewater analysis, is about on par as what it was when wastewater analysis commenced back in 2016. But fewer people are using it in raw numbers. So what does this mean in terms of risks and prices then? This is what I call the paradox of prohibition. Okay. We've got our drug enforcement being funded at a record level, $3.5 billion, which is 3 times what we were spending back in 2009, 2010. It's increased 6 times for border allocation specifically. Okay, so ABF, well, there was no ABF back then, but Australian Customs back in 2009, 2010, Australian Border Force now, their funding allocation has increased 6-fold. So huge amounts of money are going into this, hundreds of millions, well, billions of dollars when we consider the entire drug budget. They are doing stuff with this money, as I said. We've got record seizures happening at the border, we've got record seizures happening on the street, and we've got record high rates of arrest, right? Notwithstanding that little COVID bump that we saw there. but none of it is doing what Risks and Prices says it should be. Availability is stable, just the same as it was back in 2007. Drug prices generally declining, sometimes in real terms, sometimes staying stable, but as soon as we adjust for inflation, we see very significant decreases taking place. Prevalence is going a bit all over the place. Okay, so prevalence, it's going up generally for illicit drugs. What I didn't include in the previous slide, so there are some new, well, I mean, the really big one here is cocaine. That's increased massively since 2007. Some new kids on the block as well. Ketamine's become increasingly popular, hallucinogens generally, and illicit use of pharmaceuticals. These are all going up as well. Purity, this is one of the ones for real sort of economics nerds. They don't want to talk about price of drugs per gram. They want to talk about purity adjusted price. I haven't included purity here because it's really complicated to do, and I don't want to bore you all to death. But what we can say generally is if you look at the purity bounds for any of the big illicit drugs, they're all either stable or drugs are getting more pure over time. Okay, so we can exclude purity from this argument because it's just going to strengthen my critique that we're doing here of the Risks and Prices framework. So purity generally increasing, stable for some drugs, prevalence trending up generally, but massive variation between illicit drugs. This is weird, right? From a theoretical perspective, this is not what we should be seeing at all. Something weird and unaccounted for by the RPF, the Risks and Prices framework, is happening. Now, it was this conundrum that had me and a colleague, Professor David Bright, who's another criminologist at Deakin University, we were puzzling over this over a couple of beers one day because we were just honestly stumped. There was no theory inside criminology that could explain this trend that we're seeing here. And we'd go to criminology conference, we'd speak to Peter Reuter, people who came up with the RPF, and ask them if they could explain what was happening. None of them could do it. So we decided something that criminologists don't usually do, and that was to speak to a non-criminologist about what was going on. And luckily, at Deakin University, we've got some really great economists. One in particular, Associate Professor Qingjian Sun, CJ. He is a game theory economist, and we went to him and we said, right, can you look at these numbers and could you tell us possibly what is happening here? He had absolutely no idea about drug enforcement, never seen an illicit drug in his life, so we had to spend quite a lot of time sitting, talking, doing this sort of cross-disciplinary discussion. And this is actually where we, funnily enough, had the idea to start an undergraduate unit about black market economics, because he was watching my undergraduate lectures and I was watching his, and we started getting an idea that, oh, actually, maybe we should put this all into the one unit. And that's been really fun and quite popular, so we're still teaching that now. First unit in the world that's looking at this kind of stuff. Oh, thank you. That's very kind. All right. Great opportunity to plug myself up here. Anyway, thank you. So anyway, he went away and had a big think about this stuff, and then he said he was quite excited because he reckoned he'd come up with some potential solutions to the problem that we're seeing. Now, I'm going to put some important caveats up front here. These are potential solutions, okay? These are plausible explanations. Otherwise, I wouldn't be putting them forward to you, but they're not empirically tested, right? This stuff is difficult to do. CJ is, we've written papers about this, but CJ keeps complaining about the paucity of data. He's used to dealing with legal products where you've got, real fine granularity, and people openly report what they're doing, which of course in black markets they don't. But here's what we come up with. There's two potential mechanisms that I'm going to put forward to you. Now, I'm not sure if anyone has heard of game theory before. There's a famous game that's taken out of game theory called the prisoner's dilemma. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but basically, you've got two prisoners. If they both stay silent, they've both been arrested for a crime. If they both stay silent, they only get 1 year in prison each. If they both confess to the crime, they both get 5 years in prison. And if one confesses and the other doesn't, the one who doesn't confess gets 20 years in prison, and the one who does confess gets out scot-free. Now, unless you know with 100% certainty that your co-offender is going to stay silent, it always makes sense for you to confess, right? Which is weird, because you'd think looking at this, okay, well, the most obvious example is, both people stay silent, you're going to be out in a year. Why wouldn't anyone do that? Well, under conditions of uncertainty, people act in weird kinds of ways. So real life prisoner's dilemma, this is what we tend to see. People confess, they want to inform on the other, and you want to be the first person to inform on the other. Otherwise, you're looking at a long stint in prison. Which is why that social norm, snitches get stitches, that kind of thing, nobody wants to do that. The reason you've got such a strong social norm around that is because the incentive, the economic incentive, is so powerful. But basically what it tells us is under conditions of uncertainty, people act in weird kinds of ways. Now, this is the only complicated bit here, but I'm going to walk through it slowly. If you've got any questions, let me know, and I'm happy to recap after the lecture or after I talk if you like. So what we've got here is a demand schedule. This is hypothetical, but it's plausible, right? And what you'll see, we've got a bunch of prices and then we've got a bunch of quantities. You will notice that as the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up. All right? This is a basic economic principle for things that we call normal goods. Normal goods are things that if they're cheaper, we'd like to buy more of them. So, things like shoes, for example, or petrol, or beer, or cocaine. Something like that. If it's cheaper, people are typically going to consume more. That's what this means. So this is a typical kind of demand schedule here. So if there's 90 kilograms, say, of cocaine in the market, the natural price is going to sit at $300. If that cocaine becomes more scarce, people will be prepared to pay more for it. Okay, so the price will goes up to $330. All right. Now, so here we go. Yeah, $90, then the price will be $300 a gram. Now what we can do, right, this is a simplified game. There's only two players in this game, one drug trafficker and one law enforcement, monolithic entity. And what we're going to do is we're going to calculate some profits. Okay, so if the trafficker sells that cocaine, they get 90 kilograms into the country, it's $300 a gram, they're going to make $27 million profit. Okay. Now again, these are hypothetical numbers, but plausible. This is well, that's kind of what cocaine's going for these days. All right. Now, of course, in the real world, drug trafficking or drug distribution is much more complicated. You don't have a single player. You've got many different players, many different groups involved. 10 plus single groups can be involved in this, from the point of production to the point of consumption. But I think it's an amazing feat of contemporary criminal logistics that something that is only produced in the deep, dark forests of South America, you could walk out of the street if you knew the right person or have it delivered to you here very easily within the hour, which is pretty amazing. Anyway, all right, so we're going to play a game now. All right, so this is our basic two-player trafficking game. As a trafficker, so imagine you're the trafficker here, we've got a decision about how much cocaine we want to import into the country. We can import 80 kilograms, 100 kilograms, or 120 kilograms. We know that the current rate of seizures that Border Force are doing, 10% of our drugs are going to get seized at the border. All right, so let's do some calculations. If we import 100 kilograms, that's why the 10 is there, is seized by Border Force, 90 kilograms make it through. We've already done that calculation, right? So at 90 kilos, it's $300 a gram, 300 times 90 gets to our $27 million figure. Now the interesting thing about this is with this seizure rate and with prices distributed as they are, it makes the most amount of sense to send 100 kilos. Doesn't make sense to send more. If we send more, 12 kilos is intercepted, 108 gets through to the market, but at 108, we end up flooding the market. It crashes the price of cocaine. Right? So we don't want to send more because we're actually going to be making less money. 108 times 240 is roughly 26 million. So we're actually losing money if we send more. We're also losing money if we send less, right? Because 72 makes it through, 72 is $357 a gram. And this is a straight demand curve, right? So I haven't done any, it's fiddled a little bit just to make the numbers simple. But this is, as I said, this is a plausible demand curve here. Right, so this is the optimal option for us as a drug trafficker. Now, let's mix this up a bit. Let's just say Peter Dutton or somebody else with a bit of a law enforcement background comes through. We're going to win the drug war. The way we're going to do this is we're going to increase enforcement intensity. We're going to, let's say, triple or quadruple or increase by a factor of 6-fold scanning at the border again, just like has happened over the last 15 years. And our seizure rate goes from 10% to 20%. Right, well, we can do the same numbers here, right? This demand schedule is exactly the same. Now, let's do some of the quick maths here. All right, with a seizure rate of 20%, all right, 20 kilos is being seized by Border Force, 80 kilos is making it through, 80 times 330, oh no, what have I done here? Seizure rate, yeah, 80, oh, sorry, 80 times 330, oh no, yeah, 330, 226,400,000. Now the weird thing about this is if we send less, we make less money, but if we send more, we actually make more money. That is the optimum outcome from a drug trafficker if seizure rates go up. So the really weird thing about this is, yes, they're making less money than they were making under the previous situation, 27 million versus 26,880,000, but not a whole heap. But the drug traffickers aren't comparing this with this. They're comparing it to the new reality that they're in now. These are their only options, and their best option is to send more rather than less. What does this mean in terms of the amount of drugs that make it into the country? Well, instead of 90 kilos successfully making it to the market, because the drug traffickers are sending more drugs hits the market than less of the drugs. Instead of 90 kilos making it to market, we get 96. So under this scenario, kind of everybody wins. Australian Border Force looks fantastic because they're seizing record amounts of drugs. The drug traffickers are really happy because they're making the most amount of money that they can, and the drug consumers benefit because drug prices are actually going down. This is one of the plausible mechanisms that game theory has here, and that is that drug dealers, when you increase seizure rates will not send less. They will send more drugs to compensate for the profits that they're not making anymore. All right, if you've kept up with all of that, you've done fantastically. That was the one complicated bit. We can all relax a little bit now. All right, explanation number 2. What do Pablo Escobar and Coles and Woolworths have in common? All right, there's a G word here. Sounds like need that is going on. Of course, no, what I'm talking about is market share. All right, so these are what we call dominant players, all right? So they're not monopolies, but they're pretty close to it. Pablo Escobar and his Medellin cartel, the height of their operations, controlled around 80% of the US cocaine market. So huge amounts of money. Many $billion, you know, and Narcos, if you haven't seen it yet, fantastic show, you know, really excellent. Goes to, about the life and times of Pablo. Anyway, Coles and Woolies, they've got a similar kind of issue here, right? They are using the market power that they have in pretty nasty ways, right? So just like Pablo Escobar, he wants to make as much money as they can. Coles and Woolies want to make as much money as they can. In fact, they are obliged to, legally, to make as much money as they can for their shareholders. They are not out there doing us a public good, you know, selling us toilet paper or anything else. They are in it very much for the money. Now, both of these organizations, well, all three of these organizations do similar kinds of things. They will use their market share not just against their suppliers. So we've all heard about this, Coles and Woolies, you know, doing a hard number on farmers of strawberries or, you know, whatever it might be, because the suppliers have very few other options, right? Suppliers don't have that many other people who they can sell to. They need to sell to one of these. So Coles and Woolies are in a position where they can dictate the price they're going to buy these goods from. Then so too with their consumers as well. Okay, so these players will know that, okay, yeah, you could go to Aldi, but we've actually bought up all the store locations as well. They're going to use the market power that they have, not just to extort or exploit their suppliers, but also their customers as well. They can charge you more because they know you don't have anywhere else to go or very few other options. All right, now the way we treat these organizations from an intervention point of view is really interesting, okay? And this is one of the most fun that we had with CJ when Dave and I were working on the project with this. When you look at how law enforcement operate, okay, so we've already been through this. We know the vast majority of arrests are taking place of consumers, but those arrests that are targeted at suppliers. There's two kinds of suppliers that law enforcement will target. They will target low-hanging fruit. So if you make an obvious mistake in front of a cop, you know, you drop your big bag of drugs or whatever, you are going to get arrested. But if they're doing targeted investigations, they're going to go for the biggest syndicate that they can find, right? That just makes sense. They want the biggest bang for their buck. They want to get the largest amount of drugs off the street. They want to make, you know, they want to look good in front of their boss, whatever it is. So they will target the biggest players. They will go after Pablo Escobar if they can. Now, this is obviously bad news if you are Pablo Escobar, but what does it actually mean for the market itself? Okay, so, you know, bad news for my syndicate if I get targeted by the police, but what about my competitor syndicates? Well, the risk and prices framework says that if I get arrested as my head of my big drug trafficking organisation, my competitors will be quaking in their boots and they will increase drug prices to compensate for the increased risk that they are obviously facing in the market. Does anyone think that that is actually how competitors work in the illicit drug space? Is anyone crying any tears? Is anyone really that worried if me, their biggest competitor, gets knocked out? Probably not, right? What are they thinking? They're thinking, fantastic, James and his vicious drug empire has been taken down. That means we've got an opening, right? What we need to do is ramp up our productions. We're going to take his illicit drug supply. So you might recognize this guy here, for those of you who are familiar with the organization LEAP. This guy's a cop. His name is Neil Woods. He went around the UK doing lots of different drug deals. He'd infiltrate drug distribution networks over the course of many months. Then they'd execute a big swoop, scoop everyone up off the streets. And Neil Woods ended up joining Law Enforcement Against Prosecution, LEAP, because basically he noticed that by the end of the day, they would clear out an entire town centre of all this big drug traffickers working in the area, or drug suppliers. But by the end of the day, people had moved in from neighbouring towns. Okay? It made absolutely no difference. And Neil Woods, over his entire career, reckoned he disrupted the drug trade by about 2 hours. Okay? Over an entire lifetime working in law enforcement. Now, the weird thing, when we explained to CJ how this works, what we call the kingpin strategy, going for the biggest players, he shook his head a little bit because he's like, well, actually, if you look at this from an economic point of view, this is what we call an antitrust exercise. All right? So if we go back to looking at Coles and Woolies, one of the solutions that was being proposed to the cost of living crisis here, it's not going to happen, I think largely due to donations from the big two into our various political parties. But one of the solutions proposed is to break Coles and Woolworths up, right? And we have seen this in the past with big monopolies or oligopolies that form where market share is concentrated into a smaller number of players. You will break those companies up into smaller parts. This is inadvertently exactly what law enforcement are doing by targeting the biggest drug trafficking syndicates they can. What they are doing is that they are stimulating competition in illicit drug markets. That opens up market share for new players to enter. And how those players will compete with one another. Yes, drug suppliers often use violence against one another, but they also compete on price. So the net effect, whether it's an antitrust exercise in the legitimate economy or in an illicit market, is the same. The net effect is lower prices for consumers. Again, directly the opposite of what the risks and prices framework tell us. Okay, so this is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. I'm like, okay, well, what does this mean then? How can we tie this into some kind of, coherent way of thinking about what's happening? And I've come up with a term that I like, and I call it the smuggler's mindset. Okay, there's a lot of assumptions inbuilt into the risks and prices framework. A lot of it is around, okay, drug traffickers or the drug suppliers are actually bearing the risks of arrest. All right? Who is it really? Is Pablo Escobar really taking the risk if he increases shipments to the United States? I mean, maybe he's a bad example, all right, because he did get killed. But anyway, right, your average drug trafficker, you get my point, is not the mule. They are not the person that is trafficking the drugs. They're not taking most of this risk, but the profit does come to them. So one of the other assumptions that we have is that these penalties actually make any kind of, or seizures make any kind of meaningful difference. If you lose a kilo of cocaine, right, it's here, I'm about to sell that at Revolver or wherever else I might want to go to, that's a lot of money to be lost. If I've got that same kilo of cocaine in Colombia, it's worth about 1% of what it is worth here. I can buy a kilo of cocaine in Colombia for around $2,000, and as soon as it hits the wholesale market here, not the same street even that the police are buying their drugs at, right, I can charge $200,000 for that kilo of cocaine, easy. It costs me nothing, effectively, to replace those drugs that have been seized. So I can just send more, right? And as we've shown with that game theory, it makes perfect sense for them to do so. Drug enforcement, associated laws, penalties, borders. I think one of the problems that we have around here is we tend to think of this from the perspective of a normal risk-averse person, right? If I see and I'm considering getting into drug dealing, that the penalties for drug trafficking have gone from 10 years to 20 years, or there's more cops on the street. I'll be sitting there going, okay, I don't really want to do this, right? It looks much more risky, so that deterrent effect is having an effect on me. But there's always a critical mass of risk-tolerant people who are always prepared to make that gamble, right? From those people's perspective, that obstacle that whether it's a prison fence, right, or a border scanning point, whatever it is, that is not an obstacle. That is a job opportunity. You rely on that border being there for you to charge for your services from getting the drugs to point A to point B, okay? You know that if you have your gram of cannabis here, right, we can buy that for $20, same as when, 30 years ago. As soon as it gets into a prison yard, you could charge much, much more for that, okay? So that's what we call arbitrage in economic circles, right? But it relies on that fence being there, it relies on the border. So for me, as a smuggler, with this mindset, none of this is bad stuff. This is all great, right? The higher the fence, the bigger the border, the more I can charge for my services. So we need to stop, in my view, looking at this stuff as effective deterrence for the most critical mass of people, these highly risk-tolerant people who are prepared to take these risks to tap into the vast profits that can be made. All right, so I've got a few minutes left, and I want to shift now our discussion a little bit to what I call Australia's emerging war on nicotine. We're going to have some basic sort of economic insights here as well. Now, of course, it's not a standard war on drugs yet. Nicotine users are not currently criminalised in most parts of the country, but there's no reason to suppose that is how it's going to stay. The South Australian Police Commissioner has been advocating that people who buy illicit tobacco should be subject to criminal prosecution. And there are some weird, I think probably unintended effects going on here in some of the laws. So Mark Butler, when he introduced the new vape or banned consumer vapes, said that people who have vapes will not be subject to criminal prosecution. That's not actually the case. In some Australian jurisdictions, you can face prison time, theoretically, for just having a personal possession quantity of vapes. The weirdest one is actually the ACT. So ACT, as we all know, decriminalised all illicit drugs. I think that's a fantastic step forward. But if I walk down the street of the ACT and I have a gram of heroin in my pocket and a vape in my pocket, it's the vape that's going to get me into trouble with the law. All right? I can face up to a year in prison and over $30,000 for the vape. Heroin, not an issue. But what we see is there are a number of not just rhetorical but real practical similarities between Australia's nicotine regulation and the broader war on drugs. Just like the war on drugs, illicit drug prohibition, disproportionate funding and emphasis on supply restrictions. So over the past 2.5 years, what we've seen, massive increases for law enforcement. Around $280 million has gone into law enforcement, enhanced illicit tobacco and vape screening, and seizures, and around $63 million has gone into demand reduction. So public education campaigns, every vape is doing you damage, just say no to vapes. Don't know who thought that up, but clearly, not much knowledge of the drug war. Anyway, what we see is, extraordinary high levels of tobacco taxation. Australia has the most expensive cigarettes in the world now. If you're a pack-a-day smoker who wants to smoke legal cigarettes, don't know how many of there are anymore, but if you do, a low-cost brand of cigarettes over the course of a year will cost you $18,000. Yes, extraordinary amount of money, and we know that smokers are disproportionately concentrated amongst lower socioeconomic groups, right? Groups that, I don't know anyone in this room who could easily fork out $18,000. Now, this has caused an absolute nightmare for the tobacco industry. Nobody wants to talk about the tobacco industry or feel bad for them for very understandable reasons. I'm not a fan of big tobacco. They are the ultimate corporate bad guys, all right? But the decline in sales that we've seen of legal cigarettes is nothing short of staggering. In the first 7 months of 2024, the decline in legal sales of cigarettes was 29%. 29% fall in sales in the first 7 months of 2024. No industry can withstand falls in sales like that. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say we are well on the way to not having a legal tobacco industry in Australia. Now, of course, that would be fantastic news if that fall was being driven primarily by people quitting smoking. But of course it's not. It's people switching to black market alternatives. There's major problems with this, right? The head of the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission said in a recent interview last week that this was the #1 organised crime problem facing the country. Right? That is an extraordinary statement. To hear about vape deals gone wrong, where people are getting stabbed buying a vape, these are just things that would have been completely unimaginable 10 years ago. or even 6 years ago. So we've seen this massive decline in legal sales, and we've seen massive falls in government revenue as a result as well. So in our last financial year, the last budget, we predicted that we'd be taking in $15 billion in tobacco tax excise. Government doesn't like talking about this much. They always like talking about the tax increases always being the result of, we're just trying to improve people's health. But the historical function of tobacco tax excise has been to make many, many billions of dollars for government. That estimate was revised down, well, what they actually raked in was just under $10 billion. So a third of the revenue that they were expecting has fallen out the window. The ban on consumer vapes, we've got our vaping panel tomorrow, I'm not going to get into that, but I would say a lot of the concern around this I think is misguided and exaggerated in my view. We haven't seen a gateway, we haven't seen increasing smoking rates amongst vaping populations. In fact, we see the opposite. Fastest declines in smoking have occurred amongst groups that have taken up vaping in the largest numbers. But we'll get to that tomorrow. Now, the other big elephant in the room, tax. People say, well, the tax has been worth it. It's it's reduced smoking rates. Well, it hasn't, not in the last 20 years, right? If you look, and I've had my stats gurus go over this, Ed Jesse had this published in The Lancet, there is no statistical difference in the decline in smoking in the pre-tax era as there was in the post-tax era up until 2019. What changed in 2019? Between 2019 and 2023-24, we saw the biggest decline in smoking in the past 30 years, but most likely due not to the increase in tobacco tax, but to the rise of vapes. Right? In the Australian context, nearly all of which are illicit. So this is a byproduct, by and large, of government tobacco control, not a deliberate result of policy. Also, this has occurred in a time of widespread expansion of the black market. So it is not difficult to get cigarettes now that, well, you can buy cheaper ones on the black market than you could legally 10 years ago. All right. Now we have seen massive increase in tobacco seizures at the border. If you think back to the first couple of graphs that we looked at, you'll see a familiar trend. This is going through the roof. This is really worrying for people. Okay, the arson attacks. We've had over 200 arson attacks nationally in just 2 years. All right, and this is a trend that you can see here is getting worse. All right, these numbers are not complete either. This is just what I can compile from media reports. Many of these are not being reported in media. We have created the second largest illicit drug market in the country in terms of the numbers of users, right? And we are increasingly following this failed war on drugs approach that we've seen with our other illicit drugs, right? That is bad for police, it's bad for public safety, and weirdly enough, it's bad for reducing smoking as well. All right, now I've got this slide on my vaping panel presentation tomorrow, so I'll talk more about it then. But basically, despite the rhetoric that you hear from the government, world leaders in this space, let's pat ourselves all on the back, we are not the world leaders in this space. Other countries are reducing smoking faster, more effectively, and at lower cost than we are. And they're doing it primarily through increasing access to less harmful nicotine products. For me, it makes absolutely no sense that the only legal form of recreational form that you can buy here in Australia is also by far the most harmful one, leading cause of death in the country, or preventable death in the country, that will kill 1 out of every 2 long-term users. Whereas vapes, well, you can't buy them legally. All right, so a couple of things I'd like you to take out of this. Right? It's not just law enforcement that have got this wrong. The risks and prices framework has it wrong. None of the theories that have dominated criminological thinking over the past couple of decades have any of this right. Intensified enforcement is not only costly in direct terms, it also hasn't meaningfully reduced drug supply in this country. Price, even if they could consistently increase price in this country, by looking at the weird relationship, some price, some drug consumption is going up, some drug consumption is going down, doesn't actually seem to be all that influenced by price. It's driven by a complex constellation of other factors that have absolutely nothing to do with price. And that, of course, will be different between problematic and non-problematic drug users. Also important to bear in mind, the vast majority of users are not problematic. This is bad news for our emerging war on nicotine. The war on drugs is not going well, and the war on nicotine is not going to go any better. This points to a desperate need to rebalance, to reorient our drug funding away from the ever-increasing billions that are going to law enforcement and into more effective, harmful, humane demand and harm reduction services. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your attention.